Chasing in defeat against Bournemouth on Saturday at St James's Park has left questions open about the transfer window and what Newcastle United might do before the end of January. In this video I'll examine what went wrong in the game and give my thoughts on why Newcastle United do need to enter the transfer window this month. It's the NUFC Monday Show and let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to another video on the channel. Welcome back to another episode of the NUFC Monday Show. Please continue to support the channel by hitting that like button and the subscribe button if you haven't already. Really hoping to get to 1,000 subscribers by the end of the season. That'll allow me to take this channel to new heights in the coming years, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. So please do continue to support me if you are enjoying the content. Please also do get in the comment section below. Give me your thoughts on what I'm going to talk about today. There will be some transfer chat towards the end of the video with a big talking point, particularly on that right hand side and where Newcastle United might have an opportunity. But we'll get into that later. First of all, we'll have to talk about the Bournemouth game and what a disappointing afternoon it turned out to be. Came into the game with 9 straight wins, looking forward to a 10th, a history-making 10th. Alexander Isak had just broken the record of 8 goals in a row in the Premier League, was looking to hunt down Jamie Vardy's Premier League record of 11. Everything was sort of building towards it. Newcastle have been absolutely imperious over the last few weeks results-wise. Bournemouth, though, came with 9 games unbeaten and a real sort of love of chaos and a real sort of ability to upset the apple cart in so many ways, and they did exactly that. They were absolutely phenomenal from the start, and I think it really is a very fine margin. Whoever got the upper hand in the first 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes was going to set the tone, and Bournemouth skied a shot over from Antoine Semenyo in the first 2 minutes. Then they scored through Justin Kluivert, and from that moment it became a transitional game. Bournemouth, their record is fantastic when they take the lead. I think they've now won 8 out of 10 games, having gone ahead this season in the Premier League. So that shows you what they're good at, and I'll get into exactly why they did well and what Newcastle didn't do well in a minute. But just a very, very disappointing afternoon. Newcastle paid for a bad start and it never really got better. And in many ways that was reflective of Wednesday's performance against Wolves. The result was much better on that occasion. Wolves missed a lot of chances, and I came away from that game thinking, I think as a lot of Newcastle supporters did as well, if Newcastle play like this again at the start of that game, they'll be punished, and they were, and that's what really opened up the chasm that we saw across the 90 minutes. It was a tight margin in that first 5 minutes. I think if Newcastle start the game better and impose themselves and get in Bournemouth's faces, then they stem the tide and they maybe can control the game and get the victory that that everyone thought that they would do. But it was Bournemouth who did that. They were the ones who were in the faces. The referee was extremely lenient, and that was a problem for me. There was a few bookings that weren't given, I thought, in the first half. That was the case for both teams. He was letting everything go, and only Bournemouth took advantage. Only Bournemouth got into Newcastle's faces and stopped their rhythm in midfield, cut off Alexander Isak. They had a real plan and they executed it. I do think that Andoni Iraola has done a really good job with Bournemouth in that he loves chaos. He embraces the chaos. That's what Bournemouth do. They really go for teams. They don't have any inhibitions, where Newcastle, as a team going for the Champions League with a bit more expectation, perhaps can't do that, and other big teams can't do that. You see Liverpool try and win the game in a calmer manner. Manchester City win the game in a calmer manner. Bournemouth have this ability, and they remind me so much of Newcastle 2 seasons ago when they were like this, just going after teams, upsetting the apple cart, having a plan, executing it, running harder than everybody else, getting there further than everybody else. And I think for me that was what set the tone, and they really took advantage. They were putting Newcastle under so much pressure, but Newcastle were consistently trying to manage Bournemouth. They were never engaging in that midfield and getting at them themselves. There was no reducers in the middle from Bruno or Tonali. Only Joe Linton did when he got booked, when he took it a bit too far, and that was what allowed the game to maybe boil over, and the referee allowed that to happen. But as I say, Bournemouth were the ones who took full advantage of that, and they fully deserve the victory. I have no complaints about the result in terms of how it went. Bournemouth, they were fantastic across the pitch, and Justin Kluivert scored a hat-trick of, as we know, that's now more goals he scored at St James's Park in the Premier League than his dad, who played at Newcastle for a year, so that's quite an achievement if you think about it like that. Semenyo was a threat. Kirkhead scored the fourth goal from left-back was a threat, but the player I really want to focus on, and I'm going to talk about him in a column I'm going to write this week for Colossus Bets, is Dean Huijsen, the centre-back, 19 years old, arrived from Juventus, was linked with Newcastle in the summer, and he's another example, a little bit like Nikola Milenkovic, of a player who, when we talk about improving Newcastle and needing to spend 40-50 million pounds on players to do that, there's evidence out there that you can have PSR sustainable signings and additions to the team. And Huijsen was fantastic. He really marshalled Alexander Isak brilliantly, made a couple of brilliant blocks against Anthony Gordon as well in that second half. And that, for me, set the tone. The calmness at the back, the dominance in midfield, and the pace and the power in attack as well. They were just much better throughout the pitch. They reminded me, as I say, of Newcastle 2 years ago. From Newcastle's perspective, I don't think there's much needed in terms of a big inquest as to how it went wrong. That's how I've come to terms with this result, because it was a shock to the system. It was a chastening afternoon. It was difficult to watch, but you understood how it happened. They got the impetus in the first 10 minutes. They made it pay, and Newcastle struggled to find a way back into the game. On the True Faith podcast review last night, we talked about the substitutions and how they weren't particularly good, and I think that there's an issue with maybe the team's makeup generally. This isn't a problem that's only noticed Saturday, but maybe the team's makeup is all too similar. There's not much that you can bring on to the pitch that change things. I said this during that poor run. I said maybe Newcastle need a player who's a number 10, for example, and I'll get on to maybe a player who might be able to give that difference at the end of the video, as I say. But this was about who got there first, who got the momentum in the game, and that was going to always make a difference, because both teams like to play in a very similar way. You've seen it previously with Brighton and Aston Villa, and I've mentioned this on this channel. When Newcastle went to those places, invariably they got beaten quite heavily in the past at Brighton and Aston Villa, while also beating them quite heavily at St James's Park. And it comes down to the momentum. It comes down to when teams want to grab the game by the scruff of the neck and play like that, it comes down to whoever gets there first. And Bournemouth did. They didn't have the inhibitions and the fear, and they're just really seeing where this run of form will take them. Tiredness was a factor. It's not an excuse, because Bournemouth have 9 injuries and they had no substitutions, so they are very much where Newcastle were last year in terms of their squad makeup at the moment, and that's why it's so impressive that Iraola's been able to do this. But the fact that Newcastle have not been at their firing best over the last couple of games, it was a different team against Bromley, but it wasn't a convincing performance. It certainly wasn't a convincing performance for me against Wolves. It wasn't like they played against Leicester or when they played against Ipswich. It felt like this run was always going to come to an end, and Bournemouth was always going to be a difficult game to play because of the makeup of that team and the way that Iraola likes to attack teams, and he really clearly had an idea of how to beat Newcastle. You stopped Tonali, who I thought was still fairly good in the game, stopped Bruno linking up with Isak, and you cut off those players, and that was what was happening for me. Gordon wasn't in great positions throughout the game. He did have a couple of chances, as I said, in the second half. Isak, absolutely no sniff of scoring a goal to continue his record. He was marshalled really well by Huijsen, but really marshalled by the midfield as well. Everything worked brilliantly from a Bournemouth perspective, and I think ultimately you just have to hold your hands up and say they were the better team, and that can happen. Move on. Newcastle have had a fantastic run. There's no great problems with the team. They can just go again at Southampton, get themselves back on track, get that Champions League push going again. As it stands, they're currently 5th. By the time you watch this, they might be 6th, because Chelsea play against Wolves at home, and you would imagine that they'll win that game. Obviously, Man City's 6-0 win against Ipswich has really turned the tide in terms of the goal difference. That's why Newcastle were pushed out the top 4. But it's not a difficult situation to really remedy. Newcastle can go to a Southampton side that look really poor and get themselves back on track quite easily. The one question I do have long term about the makeup of the team is Joe Linton. I've said this previously. I think his midfield days are numbered, because you see the technical deficiencies he has next to Bruno and Gordon quite a few times when Newcastle did get through and they were trying to up the tempo, and it's happened a little bit at times against Wolves as well, where Gordon's touch would be brilliant. He would play it off to Tonali, who would play it off to Bruno. As soon as it would get to Joe Linton, the touch was slightly off, and Bournemouth would run the ball back and they could sweep forward. This isn't a get rid of Joe Linton now, Joelinton doesn't have a future at Newcastle because he obviously brings things that others don't. His physicality, his bite, his power when he runs forward with the ball. He has so many traits, but when Eddie Howe is trying to move the team into this different way of playing, it feels a little bit like a number 8 in that position needs higher pass completion, needs a better first touch, needs to be more technically adept to join in when you've got Isak up front who's got brilliant touch. Gordon's got fantastic quality with the ball at his feet. Tonali and Bruno being the same as well. To complete that, I think you see sometimes Murphy was the same. The game would slow down and Newcastle's momentum would slow down as soon as Joelinton and Murphy got the ball because of their technical deficiencies. It was such a technical game in this one because you knew that Bournemouth were going to be able to do the things at the other end, and credit to Bournemouth because this is a really good team. They could get Europe this season quite easily, and it's another example of a really well oiled, really well coached team coupled with some great recruitment. Huijsen, as I said, 12 million, 10 million euros for Justin Kluivert, I think. Semenyo was about 15 million euros from Bristol City. Evan Nilsson didn't play, but up front he's been very good as well. They've got so much quality for good prices, and I sort of mentioned this about Nottingham Forest. It's not a surprise to me that those two teams have done so well this season off the back of really good, clever recruitment, and Newcastle can maybe look into that a little bit more. We will talk about the transfers, as I say, in a couple of minutes, but for me, this is a game that Newcastle can just put behind them now. They can move on, get themselves back on track against Southampton, and hopefully they don't have the same issues against Fulham. I think Fulham will be a tough game back at St James's Park in a couple of weeks. But Eddie Howe mentioned it correctly. I think he said maybe it isn't a good thing, but it could be a reference for perhaps this reduced the conversation around how Newcastle are getting on, how well they're doing, all the talk around Isak, all the talk around title challenges, which were always felt premature. I know a couple of people in the comments of the last video weren't happy that I used the words title race in the headline, but it was just a sort of way to maybe get into a discussion that Newcastle were on their way up, but this has really held them back a little bit and brought them back down to earth, and ultimately that might not be the worst thing going forward. In terms of transfers, the big thing that I want to talk about in today's video is Takefusa Kubo from Real Sociedad. Craig Hope in the Daily Mail last week said that Newcastle had rejected the chance to sign him for £50 million because of finances. But this is, and ultimately PSR is still a straitjacket. They keep saying that it's still an issue. For me, this is the opportunity to strike if you can, because they've got a real opportunity to get into the Champions League, and then that allows them to avoid a complete reset of this project, because there's a possibility if they don't get into the Champions League, certainly if they don't get into Europe at all, that Alexander Isak will go at some point in the near future. Bruno Guimaraes is in that conversation as well, that those players are going to get restless because they've only got a certain amount of time in their careers. They can't be on this journey for too long, and it would feel like a bit of a reset if they miss out. So now's an opportunity to strike, to give themselves some momentum, and maybe some deficiencies that I mentioned about Jacob Murphy on that right hand side from Saturday. This is a great opportunity if there's a player out there to go and sign to strengthen on that right hand side. I believe Kubo is that player. If there was an opportunity to sign him this window, they should absolutely take it. He's a player that gives me Alexander Isak vibes in the fact that he's got all the attributes, he's got a lot of quality, he's a great age at 23, and he's proven himself in a higher level away from the Premier League, and he would come into the Premier League and hit the ground running, in my opinion, in a way that Isak did, but he's also not being courted too much by the big clubs. He's not overly expensive, he's not too much out of Newcastle's league that it wouldn't work, and I think that's the great recipe for success. If you look at most of Newcastle signings, Bruno, Isak, Gordon, Botman, they've all been players that the big clubs have been aware of, and Kubo played for Real Madrid and has had a great time in Spain with Mallorca and Villarreal, now Real Sociedad. If you look at those signings that Newcastle have made, they've all been on the radar of big clubs who just haven't quite had the bottle to go and sign them for the prices that have been offered. And Newcastle have been rewarded with that. They've got the player that Gordon promised to be at Everton, and much more. They've got the player that Real Sociedad had, in my opinion, in Isak. This is where I'm drawing the comparisons from, because Arsenal are now so desperate to sign him, but they had the chance and didn't take it. Newcastle got an opportunity to sign a player in Kubo who is so dynamic, so good in transition, so good in possession, such a hard worker, presses really high, such an Eddie Howe player, so direct, so energetic, but also would suit personality-wise in terms of very mouldable, has developed himself. He's another player that I followed for quite a while because I caught him in World Soccer when he was at FC Tokyo years ago, similar to Isak. I've kept an eye on him since. And when he came to Spain, he's never really had that opportunity at Real Madrid, but he's taken it everywhere else. Mallorca got him the move to Villarreal. Villarreal got him the permanent move to Real Sociedad. So £50 million might sound steep, but that's his release clause. So maybe you could talk it down and maybe negotiate on that. But if there's an opportunity to strike now, I would absolutely do that. Perhaps if they're not, then they're looking at Mbumo or Dibbling in the summer. But for me, Kubo is that perfect blend of got enough quality, not known enough quantity to everybody that people are desperately queuing up to sign him in a way that Mbumo, if he comes available in the summer, Liverpool have been linked, Arsenal have previously been linked. I think if Kubo is available, Newcastle can really strike a deal that would take them to a new level. For me, that's the player that they should be going for. And if that could be done in January, then now's the time that they need to strike, because it could be the difference between Champions League football, and the difference between Champions League football or not is the difference between whether this project continues in this vein and they are able to be more sustainable, because if they get the Champions League revenue, that will help them no end again. We saw what that did in terms of them signing Tonali and Livramento and Hall. Obviously, that was pre this PSR issue that sort of really grabbed them in the way that it has, but it would certainly free up some money and then they could attack it. That is really worth it for me. Especially if you can sell a couple of players, and again we'll talk about that in a second. But Kubo, for me, if there's an opportunity to do this deal, I would absolutely go for it. But at the same time, as I've mentioned before, Bournemouth have proven that there are upgrades out there for cheaper options. Newcastle need to be scouring and be clever in the market, a lot like Bournemouth, and that's a great example of that. Just like Forest a few weeks ago as well, when I talked about Milenkovic. There are some great examples of players who are clearly good enough. Huijsen was linked with Newcastle last season, 19 years old, very raw, but he looks incredibly ready. And I do think that Newcastle are maybe too hung up on what the good deal is. I think they were so desperate to sign Mark Gahey or nobody in the summer that proved the wrong decision. They can't make that mistake again in January. If there are clever deals to be done, go and do them. And then I would say that Kubo, even at £50 million, if that is it's all doable, even if it's a bit of a risk, go and do it, because he would transform that right-hand side. He's so good on the ball. He's so good, such a good dribbler, so good at link-up play with strikers. But also, crucially, as I mentioned earlier, Newcastle needed somebody maybe who can change things in the team. Maybe who can do something a little bit different. He's a right-hand side player who can also play, crucially, in number 10, and he doesn't look out of place. He could play 4-2-3-1. And he could be a real link between the attack and midfield in a way that Bruno kind of has been, but in a less fluid way, in a sort of different, more structured way when things aren't going well in games, for example, or when you're playing different opposition. He would give you that option, and for me, that's a deal that Newcastle should absolutely look to do if they can. The only other thing to say, other than Miguel Almiron's probably likely to leave this week, we'll see how that transpires, but Lloyd Kelly and his interest from Fenerbahce. Juventus have apparently joined the race to sign him. 13 million euros apparently. No deal. That there was apparently a bid over the weekend that hasn't been anywhere near Newcastle's valuation. I think that this situation hasn't really changed from Newcastle's perspective. If somebody comes with the right offer, then they will consider it because of the PSR situation. If there's a player who's getting this sort of amount of money offered for them who isn't in the first team picture, you simply have to consider it, and I think it would hopefully allow Newcastle to do something between now and the end of January, but it would certainly at the very least allow them to go into the summer with a lot of momentum in terms of transfers. Hopefully, if they're in the Champions League as well, then they could have a really, really great summer. But I think it's worth spending a little bit to accumulate now on somebody like a Kubo, perhaps, because someone like Mbumo is going to be really difficult to get out. But if they were offered that opportunity for £50 million as a release clause, it might be slightly above what Newcastle would ideally like to pay for somebody like Kubo. But similarly to Isak, it's worth it in the long run. I think he would really come into the team and take it to a new level and find that balance in the side, because Newcastle never really had that. They've had players who've had a purple patch in Almiron and Murphy, but there's always been a limitation. I think Kubo can get to the level similarly to Gordon and be another of those players in that top bracket for Newcastle. And this is a great opportunity that I think they should strike for. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share and subscribe. I'll be back on Thursday with more talk about Newcastle's transfer situation and looking ahead to that game at Southampton. See you then. Cheers.